Today, we are honored to welcome back to this podium one of our favorite speakers. Perry, I think it's safe to say that you have addressed this club as our featured speaker more than anyone else in recent memory. And I can't think of anyone more appropriate to attend this annual gathering celebrating the Winners for Life. For those of you who may not know Perry, those few of you who may not know Perry, he is the Education Director of the Seattle Opera. In that role, it is clear that Perry defines education in the broadest possible terms. Opera at its best moves us, touches us, and ennobles us like no other art form. It brings us face to face with our own shortcomings and then dispenses absolution and grace. Perry has transported us behind that magical curtain. In so doing, he has inspired us to believe that we can be better human beings and uplifted us with a vision of a better world. We have come to respect him for his wisdom, his humility, and his humanity. Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Rotarians, please welcome Perry Lorenzo.
Thank you very much, Bill, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to be here at the Seattle Rotary. If not still the largest Rotary in the world, I believe one of the largest Rotaries in the world. And I love the expressions that you have on your literature, expressions like building on our century of service. You meet once a week. For the rest of the week, we live in the world of bitterness, sarcasm, irony, and depression. And once a week, we get to say sentences like, building on our century of service, and that's pretty great. I believe the student who just spoke, where are you? Kelsey, I believe that's your name? Where are you? Kelsey, I think you said you were breaking out of your shell, huh? So I think you're going to be giving Hillary and Rudy a run for their money upcoming, so congratulations to you. And we can't clap enough for the 51 fabulous students of Seattle Public High Schools who are the winners for life. There isn't a thing, I'm going to say, there isn't a thing that opera can sing that is anywhere close to the courageous and heroic achievement in your young life. So God bless all of you, and we're in such admiration of what you've accomplished. Thank you. And a special nod to Raj Manhas, Seattle's superintendent of schools, who spoke at the reception for the Winners of Life earlier this morning. The Seattle Rotary is going to host a special Raj Manhas Day at your upcoming Wednesday Rotary on May 9th. It's going to take place, I'm happy to say, at McCaw Hall, the home of the Seattle International Film Festival, the Pacific Northwest Ballet, and most of all, of course, Seattle Opera. From Seattle Opera, you've already been introduced to Kelly Tweedale, a Seattle Rotarian who's our administrative director, to John Nesholm, our chair, and to members of the board and staff of Seattle Opera. I understand there are some guidelines which would, by etiquette, prevent me from pushing our product. SeattleOpera.org 3897676, and the little purple postcards that are on your table, I will not talk about. However, your president, Bill Center, just a few moments ago told me that he was so excited about Seattle Opera's upcoming La Boheme that he wants everyone in this room to buy a ticket. And as long as he's your president telling you to do that, I want to underscore his evocation of support. Now, you're supposed to begin a speech like this for a Rotary with a joke, and I wrote this speech last week, and I had a joke, but reading it over on the bus on the way here this morning, I decided it wasn't very funny. I live on Capitol Hill in Seattle, and I don't own a car, so I took the bus downtown. And in my neighborhood and between it and downtown, there are a lot of new buildings going up. I love new buildings going up because they remind me of civilization. And I hate buildings being knocked down because it reminds me of destruction. And as we passed on the bus one of those buildings, it's a new building that hasn't opened yet, and beautiful building, and some of the windows on the street level had already been knocked down and bashed in. I had passed by it last night, and they weren't bashed in and knocked down, and this morning some workers apparently had put up some plywood to cover the bashed-in windows. And it's not that big a deal, but it just made me think about the duality of civilization and destruction, that building buildings and building up people is civilization, and knocking down people is destruction. And of course, here we are at the Rotary on our inspiring and uplifting Wednesday, celebrating these 51 great kids that are here. And yet, we all know, reading the news and watching television, that this is one part of civilization and human life. And yet, even in our schools, which are supposed to be communities of hope for the future, terrible things have happened on both coasts of the United States. And it would belittle the tragedies of the persons involved to use what happened in Seattle and what happened in Virginia as a trope for a speech. But since it's on our minds, I want to use those examples as a question. How are we building civilization? And how are we tragically participating in destruction? How can we build civilization? And since I work at Seattle Opera, how can art contribute to building civilization? And since we're celebrating young people today, what does art and what does civilization have to do with our kids? I remember a TV series when I was a kid by Lord Kenneth Clark called Civilization, in which he said that civilization is a thin veneer over destruction, that civilization is a creation of human beings, and yet it's fragile before the destructiveness of human beings. I remember as a kid, don't you, that television back in the, well, let's see, for most of you when you were children in the 70s, I suppose, the television was the window to the outside world, the window to civilization. When I was a little kid in the late 50s and early 60s, once a year, this wonderful thing about civilization came on television. It was the annual showing of The Wizard of Oz. Didn't you look forward to it yourself when you were a kid? Now, my parents had a black and white television, and I watched The Wizard of Oz each year. For you teenagers, there was a time when there was only black and white television, and a time when you couldn't get every movie in the world at a moment's notice. But every year, the black and white version of The Wizard of Oz came on TV. I had never seen color television. I had never seen a movie, as a matter of fact. I kind of thought that the world outside my parents' house was in black and white, because that's the way it was on TV. Imagine the surprise of a kid watching The Wizard of Oz when his parents had just purchased one of the first color televisions. And I had never seen a color television show before. My parents didn't tell me what it was. The first half hour of The Wizard of Oz is in black and white, and suddenly the house hits Munchkinland, and Judy Garland opens the door, and suddenly, Technicolor. My parents tell me that I screamed with delight and ran out of the room, because there was an artistic experience of the transformation of life from black and white into color. How can we build a civilization where we can transform life from black and white into color? When I was a little bit older watching television, there were two great series that I think launched me in my own career. One was from New York City on public television called Leonard Bernstein's Young Persons Concerts. Perhaps many of you remember watching those. Here was this great American conductor, this great American composer, this great American teacher sharing with kids in the audience and kids all over the country about Bach and Beethoven and the Beatles and syncopation and jazz and music theater and opera and Mozart and melody. It got me so excited about life. Didn't you have experiences as a kid, perhaps, that got you excited about life? How can we build a civilization where we're getting excited about life? Also on television, as I already mentioned, I enjoyed that Kenneth Clark series called Civilization, where he introduced the audience to paintings and statues and music and poetry and drama and buildings and city planning and culture and the way human persons interact. It really inspired me when I was a kid. Didn't you have experiences like that perhaps when you were a kid? Inspired perhaps to fall in love, not only with beauty, but with societies, communities, the city that can build such beauty. And then, of course, when I got a little older, I had the chance to go experience art eye to eye, fingertip to fingertip, a chance to, as it were, touch and taste and smell art, the real sensual experience of real art. It doesn't have to be high-class art. It could be television. It could be the school play. It could be the athletics at the school where we celebrate the excellence of human beauty and achievement. Didn't you have experiences like that when you were a kid? How can we build a civilization where we can inspire each other to reach out and touch the excellence of human achievement? Lord Kenneth Clark on television, his TV series and book, Civilization, is often criticized nowadays in a more politically correct era. His series focused on Western Europe, and it was a very subjective interpretation of art. But he admitted it himself and called the series Civilization: A Personal View. Well, for the rest of this morning and early afternoon, I'd like to take the chance to reflect in a similar way on civilization, but rather on the topic art and childhood, and admit that it's a personal view. I'd like to just relate to you 3 rather odd experiences I had before I was out of high school that really touched me about art and the meaning of life and the beauty of civilization. And I'm only doing this about me because I've got the mic. I'm doing this so that you, all of us together, can remember, both young and older in this room, remember our childhood and remember what experiences did you have that were like this. First of all, when I was a little kid, when I was 6, I went to my first play, my first live play. My father was, amongst other things, an actor, and my family took me to see a production, rather prophetically, of Oscar Wilde's Lady Windermere's Fan. I had never been to a play before. My father played the Oscar Wilde character, who's usually played by Rupert Everett in the movie versions of these things, and he had all the witty one-liners. And there I was out in the middle of the 300 people in the audience sitting next to my mother, and my father walked out on stage. I didn't really know what a stage was. I was in church, as far as I could tell. My father walked out on stage and uttered those witty one-liners of Oscar Wilde, and 300 people in the audience began to laugh. And I had never been to a play before. I didn't know what theater was, and I thought that 300 people were laughing at my father. So I started to cry. And my wise mother took me backstage during intermission and took me, if this were the stage with the proscenium arch, took me backstage right over here next to the stage manager's console. I've had great admiration for stage managers ever since. And I suddenly realized at age 6, without knowing the words for it, I suddenly realized what art could do. Because I became aware, standing next to the stage manager, of 2 worlds. That world and this world. That world out there where you are, you know, the real world. And this world in light, the really real world. You know, that world out there, your world, the black and white world, your gray, meaningless, bitter, existentially depressed, limited world of mutability, change, and let's admit it, disease, destruction, and death. The real world. And yet here, up here, was the really real world of beauty and goodness and truth and inspiration. even though it was fake, held up by plywood and lit by colored gels. The really real world, all the more beautiful than the real world because it can't ever be destroyed, because it's already artifice. And I realized as a little kid something that later on I got words for, the platonic duality of artistic experience. That art, that beauty, is a kind of really real world that brings color and life to our real world of daily desperation and despair. And as a 6-year-old who had never yet read Plato, I wanted what Plato would teach to be true, that the really real world of beauty could somehow redeem or inspire or make meaning in the world out there. Was that ever true for you in any way as a kid? Some experience that drew you out of yourself and inspired your life and gave it meaning. Later on, I would read that the Greek philosopher Plato described art like that. Art and beauty are like an arrow, he wrote, an arrow of beauty that strikes us and causes a wound of eros. And that eros would grow wings and make us yearn for something besides ourselves. The first thing I learned about art as a little kid is that art can draw us outside of ourselves, from the real to the really real world. Second, as I got a little older, I watched a lot of television, and I've already referred to Kenneth Clark's Civilization series. I watched it twice over a 13-week period because it was on Sunday and Tuesday nights on PBS. And so I got to watch it, think about it, and then watch it again. And then, of course, they made a book about it, and it was terrific to have all these materials to get into this magnificent introduction to European civilization. And not only did it make me fall in love with statues and paintings and music and drama and poetry and buildings and city planning and cities, it also got my childish brain awake to the amazing reality of talented individuals, artists, who are pretty special, who are rather like you 51 fabulous winners for life, people that usually overcame hardships and strove for excellence that still remains today. And not only the artists, but the institutions that supported those artists. Of course, there was art when there were only cave people. It was up on the walls. But the great art of the great civilizations of the world required institutions, schools, states, governments, even banks. The Medici were bankers, showing you that corporate sponsorship was there from the start for these organizations. And Lord Kenneth Clark taught me to look as the evaluation of a civilization, what art it leaves behind. Well, limiting ourselves only to Western Europe, what are those cities and civilizations we remember? Athens, Florence, Rome, Paris. Arguably, none of those cities are the great world powers they once were, yet what still draws over 100,000 people to Rome's Piazza di San Pietro by Bernini every day? But art, the art of architecture, city planning, and the sharing of beauty. Kenneth Clark, in his Civilization series, inspired me to think not only about the wound of Eros, but also about the artists that create that beauty, and also about the societies, the Seattle perhaps, that can support that art and that celebration of human achievement. I didn't know it at the time, of course, but Plato also had something to say about that. Plato said that beauty wounds us with an arrow that causes Eros to grow wings and yearn back for it. And further, if by Eros for beauty we can fall in love with individual beauty, we might also be able to fall in love with the beauty of people, the beauty of the institutions that support people, and the beauty of human society that forms civilization. Plato called that the ascent of eros to the common good. Have you had any experiences in your life as a child or an adult like that, where the experience of human beauty and the thrill of your pulse when you saw it inspired you to make your world a better place? A Seattle philanthropist, God bless her, Patsy Collins, told me the year before she passed away, "I want to make Seattle a better place." A phrase that's easy to make fun of. She did, and you do, building on our century of service. That's the inspiration of human civilization that Lord Kenneth Clark on television taught me when I was a kid. Third, I had a live experience of opera when I was a teenager. It's beyond the time of being a kid, I suppose. We call teenagers, like you folks, you 51 winners for life, young persons, young adults. Well, for me, when I was a teenager, it was the moment when adolescence was kicking in with its full awareness of erotic arousal. And at age 15, I had a chance to be aroused by eros by attending my first opera. I already knew about opera from television and from Leonard Bernstein and Kenneth Clark and from my father taking me to the theater, but I had never been to a real opera. And in March of 1975, I attended my first live opera with a high school friend of mine. The opera was called Götterdämmerung. And it's the fourth of the 4 operas called The Ring of the Nibelung, and we saw it at Seattle Opera, the first time it had done that opera, and the beginning of several decades of Seattle Opera doing the operas of Richard Wagner. I didn't know at the time how important for me or for Seattle or for opera or whatever that ring would be. But my high school friend, whose name was Paul, and I, who attended this opera, were just enraptured by it. We were teenagers whose eros was ready for this wound. And over the first act of Götterdämmerung, we were awakened to beauty and excitement and thrill. And by the end of the second act of Götterdämmerung, we were writhing with pain, sympathizing with the destructive violence and urge for death that the characters were hurling themselves to. And by the end of the third act of Götterdämmerung, we were overcome by Brunhilde's singing of her glorious immolation, that triumphant hymn of healing and forgiveness and love. And when that show was done in the old Opera House at Seattle Center, my high school friend Paul Raffanelli and I turned to each other and said, "We want to do that." Well, when I grew up, I was lucky enough to get the job that I have, and Paul Raffanelli grew up to become the principal bassoonist in the Seattle Symphony, to create art for generations coming. In other words, sometimes experiences of art, at the moment that we're ready for them, can so arouse our desire for beauty that we want to just reach out and touch it. Plato, once again, called that kind of response to beauty an eternal longing. And religious people, of course, would define it as the longing for the beauty on the face of God. And non-religious people would describe it perhaps as the longing for the infinite horizon of human dignity and achievement. Have you ever had an experience which made you long for the infinite horizon? Perhaps in conclusion, we might just ask those 3 questions again. Can art lift us out of ourselves? Can art make us fall in love with people, with artists, and with society? Can art make us long for the one and the true and the good and the beautiful of the infinite? Well, I'd like to conclude with the concluding words of Lord Kenneth Clark's Civilization series. At the end of his 13 episodes, he made a rather personal confession, which I think sums up what we're celebrating here this noontime, both for our 51 students, for all the Rotarians, and for what all of us as citizens of Seattle probably feel when we face the news every day. Kenneth Clark said at the end of his book and series, Civilization, "I believe that order is better than chaos, creation better than destruction. I prefer gentleness to violence, forgiveness to vendetta. On the whole, I think that knowledge is preferable to ignorance, and I am sure that human sympathy and compassion are more valuable than ideology. I believe that in spite of the recent triumphs of science, human beings haven't changed much in the last several thousand years, and in consequence, civilization must always be defended, and we must always learn from history. History now is ourselves." I also hold a couple beliefs that are more difficult to put shortly. For example, I believe in courtesy, the ritual by which we avoid hurting other people by satisfying our own pride. And I think that we should remember that we are all part of a great whole, which for convenience we call nature. All living things are our brothers and sisters. Above all, I believe in the God-given genius of certain individuals, and I value a society that makes their existence possible. Yes, art can lift us out of ourselves. Yes, art can make us fall in love with people, artists, and society. Yes, art can make us yearn for the one, the true, the good, and the beautiful, for the infinite horizon of the human person. Art can make us yearn for human civilization. Thank you.
I have given Perry dispensation to go to his next speaking engagement at the University Club in about 20 minutes. And thank you, sir. And that brings us to this week's pretty good rule. I suspect that this is a rule our winners for life have already mastered. Never say you don't have enough time. You have precisely the same amount of time as everyone else. Use it wisely. We are adjourned. See you next week.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from Enterprise Seattle. For over 35 years, Enterprise Seattle has provided client-based economic development services to businesses throughout King County and its 39 cities. More information on Enterprise Seattle and how they help businesses grow and prosper can be found at www.enterpriseseattle.org. And by First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.